Então, bom dia a todos. Estamos aqui hoje realizando uma atividade do Centro de História da Ciência, tendo a honra da presença do professor Aviezer, professor da Universidade de Harvard. Então, ele vai falar hoje sobre Origens e Filosofia of Historiography. So, thank you, Professor Tucker, for being here with us. Professor Tucker has a long career on this field, on philosophy, on history of politics and historiography and energy, several fields. And his education is University of Maryland. He got his PhD in US and then Columbia University. Then he held positions at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science, University of Cologne, both in Germany. And he spent also some time in Czech Republic and Australia. And his previous position was at University of Texas at Austin. And now he's holding a position, associate position, in Harvard University. So your seminar is Origins and the Philosophy of Historiography. So thank you, Professor, for giving this seminar to the Center for History of Science of the University of São Paulo. Please feel free now to give your...
Obrigado. I used all the Portuguese I know. Okay. I was asked not to assume too much about what you know or what you don't know. So please, if I'm saying things that are obvious or I'm too slow, then just do something like this. And if I'm like running too fast with my English and you don't understand me, or I'm talking about things that you don't quite follow, then just do like this. And give me this kind of, background so I can understand what's the effect of what I'm saying. The basic topic of philosophy of historiography is our knowledge of the past. That is, we think that we know a lot of things about the past. We think that we know that the universe started about 13.7 billion years ago with a Big Bang. We think that the solar system is about 6 billion years old. We think that planet Earth is about 4 billion years old. We think that there was a last common ancestor of human beings and apes. We think that there was a common language, a Proto-Indo-European language that preceded Sanskrit and the Indo-European languages. We think that there was a Napoleon Bonaparte in the Second World War. And the question that we ask ourselves in the philosophy of historiography is how do we know that? And what is the status of this knowledge in comparison with other types of knowledge? By distinction, there is another field that we call the philosophy of history. If German helps here, there is Geschichtsphilosophy and Geschichtsschreibung philosophy. Philosophy of history asks what is the meaning of history? What is the cycle of history? And that would correspond with philosophers like Hegel or Marx that may well be more famous than philosophers who deal with the problem of historical knowledge. I'm not Hegel and I'm not Marx, and I'm not going to tell you what is the meaning of history. And I was last month I gave a paper in Jena in Germany. That's where Hegel said that he saw the end of history in the Battle of Jena with Napoleon. I didn't see the end of history there. Maybe I saw it last week in America. But I have no insight into that. I have no understanding of that. Maybe 100 years from now, we will have a better understanding when it's all over, hopefully. Anyway, The problem of historical knowledge, I think, emerges from two common mistakes, two common extreme positions that you will find many people supporting, at least historically. One is a view that emerged in the 19th century, where the model of knowledge was empirical knowledge, emerging, let's say, from Newtonian physics. And the idea was that maybe we can know about history in the same way that we can know about astronomy. How do we know that the planets go around the sun? Well, we look in a telescope and we observe them. And then we make hypotheses about how the planet moves, and we presume that there are forces like gravity. And then we test those hypotheses against observations, and if the observations fit, then we get it right. And the idea here would be that historians can look in their telescope into the sky of history, and the same way that the astronomer can see Venus or Mars move in a certain way, they can see nations and classes and cultures move in a certain way, and then they will see a pattern, the same way that we will look. If you look in the sky, we will see certain patterns. And then they would hypothesize, and that would be the science of history. And if we can have laws, the covering laws, then we can have a theory of history similarly to the theory of physics. Now, in my opinion, there's a very simple problem that I can observe planet Venus in a telescope. I never observed Napoleon, and I never will. Nor will you. There are no given facts in history. There's nothing that is immediately observable, like the planets, or like things that you will look in a microscope. Everything that we know about history is inferred. What we see are documents in archives. So the fact that I believe that there was a Napoleon Bonaparte and there was a George Washington is simply, if I follow the footnotes in books that were written about Napoleon or George Washington, is that there are many, many documents about them. And there are two ways of looking at it. Either there's this vast conspiracy. There never was a Napoleon Bonaparte, but just millions of little people forged all these documents about Napoleon and spent many, many years distributing them in all sorts of archives. Or there probably was a Napoleon Bonaparte. These are the two choices. Now, the conclusion of that is that Napoleon Bonaparte is not a fact, but it's just extremely highly probable hypothesis that explains what is observable, and that's usually what we would find in archives. Therefore, the historical sciences, and here I would include not just the history of the human race, but the history of species, the history of life, the history of the planets, the history of the cosmos. None of them is an empirical science in the sense of being able to observe the objects that you study. We cannot observe the Big Bang. We can observe background radiation that was created by the Big Bang. We cannot observe the last common ancestor of humans and apes. We infer the existence of this creature from the similarities, or Darwin inferred it from the similarities between human and apes. We don't know much about Proto-Indo-European, the language from which Sanskrit and ancient Greek and so on, and Portuguese and English descended, but we know that there was such a language. The other opposite mistake, in my opinion, to conceiving historiography as an empirical science is to believe that it is just a story. That's the narrativistic view of historical knowledge. Now, there's no denying that the best way to make money as a historian is to write a bestseller, to write the history of Latin America, the history of Europe, the history of Brazil. And that will make you, if you write it well, and you write a good story, you can sell some books. But if you want other historians to appreciate you, that's actually not the way to do it. If you want other historians to respect you, you need to discover something new. You need to discover new evidence. Yeah, probably you know about Histoire Annale, right? It's sort of the French. Right? So what was so great about Marc Bloch? Marc Bloch looked at the shapes of fields in France. That was a new type of evidence. And Marc Bloch inferred that from the shape of fields today, meaning 1930s, he could see what was the kind of economy that was in the Middle Ages in France. That made him into a great historian, because these fields were there, forever. And people saw them, but they never realized that these fields preserved information. Now, at the end of the process of writing historiography, indeed, sometimes people write stories, sometimes they don't. In my opinion, the important thing is not the shape of the story. The important thing is the evidence that supports the story, if there is a story to be told. And not all the stories are equally good. Some stories are more probable than other stories, and sometimes there are no stories at all. So I use the expression superstructure. That is, historians do research. And from their research, they discover evidence. And from the evidence, they discover all sorts of things about the past. Once they have these discoveries, they put it into a narrative shape, which is kind of a superstructure built above all that research. But the important thing is the research, it's not the story. Because not all stories are equally true. Not all stories are equally probable. And that's where I part way with some of our French friends who just see it all as it's all stories, and all the stories are politically motivated and politically biased. Now, it's true that there are stories. It's true that stories are used for political purposes. But what makes them into good or bad stories is not their politics. It's their evidence. So the general view that I present then is neither empirical nor narrativistic. It is probabilistic. By probabilistic, what I mean is that what is attached to each piece of knowledge that historians tell us is a probability. Sometimes it's extremely high probability, and then we say it's a fact. But it's not a fact in the sense that I can see you right now. It's a fact in the sense that it's so probable that I don't really need to consider an alternative. I never met Napoleon, and I never will, and I never see Napoleon, and I don't know anybody who saw Napoleon, and I never will meet anybody who saw Napoleon. But Napoleon is so probable. If I have to put it, it's 0.9999, into infinity, that I say, well, there was a Napoleon, and it is a fact. Now, how probable is probable enough depends on context. In an epistemic sense, and that's called epistemic contextualism, it's based on context, just think, is your bank open on Saturday? Do you know if your bank is open on Saturday? Or that's just a general rule in Brazil? Okay. Because in the United States, sometimes it's open and sometimes it's not. Now, my point is that if all I need to do is deposit a check, and my memory says it's open on Saturday, I don't need to go there on Friday, then it's good enough, it's probable enough. So I say I know that the bank is open on Saturday. But if you put it in a different context, suppose that I owe a lot of money on my house, and I need to deposit this check this week, or the bank will repossess my house, they will take my house away. The fact that I remember that the bank is open on Saturday, is that good enough? Because if it's not good enough, I'm going to lose my home. Maybe I should double check. Maybe the probability is not high enough if it's so important. Right? So it is context dependent. And in history, you will see it in the difference between what we believe about living people who are still alive and people who are not alive anymore. That is, suppose that we had a military regime. Suppose that we will have a military regime. And there is a single text that says somebody was an informant for that regime. Now, if that regime was in the 19th century and that person is dead and their children are dead and their children are dead, no, it's a good enough proof. Probably this fellow was an informant for the regime. Suppose he's still alive and it happened 20 years ago, or it will happen 10 years from now. That's not good enough. One text is not good enough. Because police make mistakes, police forge documents, it's not good enough. And that's context dependent. Okay, so suppose that we agree that our knowledge of history of the past is all probabilistic. How probable is probable enough depends on context. So what is actually happening? What is the ontology that I'm working with? How do we get to know things about the past? How do we achieve this probable knowledge? And here my model, and now I'm getting to the sort of more original work that I've been doing. This is the book that I've been published about our knowledge of the past. I work with the concept of information. That is, every historical event, you can see it not in terms of cause and effect, but in terms of an explosion of information burst. So suppose that we have a friend who couldn't make it now, today, but he's really very interested, or she's very interested in this lecture, right? So suppose that tomorrow they want to find out what was I talking about. They will have a fairly easy job. What they will have to do is just interview you. And even if half of you are unavailable, you go on vacation, still the other half would be enough to reconstruct a highly reliable story about what I was talking about today. Now, suppose that the same challenge happens 100 years from now. That is, 100 years from now, somebody finds this poster that I was speaking here. Okay, probable enough, Tucker came to Sao Paulo and gave a paper. Now, what was he talking about? Now, we will all be dead, obviously. Some people may take notes. Maybe that will not be available anymore. They will get lost. Somebody is filming this. Maybe this will still be on YouTube. That will be excellent. If not, 100 years from now, there will be a different technology. What will happen? What happens is this information decays. That is, the information that I'm creating right now in this act of speaking, this burst of information now is very strong. And there are several independent information signals that are leaving from me into each one of you. And you can forward this information signal. But as time goes by, your memories will fade. This is a very great moment in your life. You don't realize it, and you will still not realize it. And you will forget me, and you forget what I'm talking about. And then eventually you will die, and I will die, and it will all disappear. And it will get mixed up with noise, because you will hear other lectures and other opinions, and maybe you will read something that I will write 10 years from now, if I'm still writing 10 years from now, and it will all get mixed up. That's a problem of accepting the information signal, preserving it, and then extracting from the information signal the information and that is mixed with noise. That is, get apart the noise, get rid of the noise. And much of what happens in our knowledge of the past is about this extracting of the information from the signals, recognizing the signals and extracting that information. So if Mark Bloch looked at the shape of fields that were available there, for hundreds of years in France, and he inferred if this is the shape of the field, this is the economy. No, this is how many people could live on such a field. This is how this was the family structure. What he found out, he recovered the information signal, and he separated it from, let's say, later noise, because maybe there were some changes in the field made in the 18th century, but the old signs were still there, so he was able to do that. If a linguist compares Sanskrit and ancient Greek and Latin and concludes that the similarities between them are not coincidental, what they're doing is they're finding the signal from this original event, that original in the European language, if there was such a language, and trying to extract that. And when historians walk into the archives, this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to distinguish forgeries, that's noise, from the information. And once you have an information signal, you have to try and track it back to the origin of that information. When did it really come from? To take, yeah, that's actually an excellent example for Brazil. The donation of Constantine. That's a document that presumably divided, that provided the basis for dividing Latin America between Spain and Portugal. It was a forged document. It had nothing to do with Constantine the Great or with a pope, or it was a later forgery. Now, if you look at it as a signal from Constantine, it's just noise. But if you look at it as evidence for the people who forged it and for their interest in forging it, then actually it gives you an interesting information signal about something else. And that's, I think, much of what historians are doing, is they are trying to extract information signals that appear in the presence. And here is the basis for the distinction between what I call the historical sciences and the theoretical sciences. That is, philosophers have been debating how to divide the fields of knowledge now for hundreds of years. And it was also a debate that had to do with how to structure the university. Why should we have a faculty of humanities? Why should we have a faculty of social sciences or natural sciences? Now, one way of trying to do this division is according to the objects. That is, if there is a specific way of studying human beings, which is different from studying other phenomena, natural phenomena, then we need to have a faculty of humanities, or faculties of social sciences, and faculty of natural sciences. Now, the problem with that is that this is a 19th century distinction which doesn't really correspond with any particular methodology. That is, since the invention of psychology, it's been proved that you can use scientific methods to study human beings. There's really no reason to presume that because what you study is human beings, then you need a different methodology than if you study natural phenomena. And humanities were in denial about that for a long time. So the bureaucratic measure that Hegel took when he was in Berlin was he just never allowed there to be a chair of psychology. Germany got the first psychology professor after Hegel died. Hegel had to die first, and then there was psychology. Now, what I argue is that, in fact, the distinction is not between sciences that have certain subject matter, human beings, society, other living things, things that are not alive, but according to whether you're trying to extract information from information signals that originated in the past, and sciences that are not interested in extracting information signals from the past. So let's see which sciences are trying to extract information that originated in the past. So obviously human history. So we're talking about human events, and usually they are preserved in documents. Not only documents, there's also material evidence, as Mark Bloch worked with fields. You can try and study paintings, you can try and study archaeological evidence. There is the history of life, and information from the history of life is preserved either in DNA, which is what phylogeny is doing, trying to discover the origins of species and common origins of species, or in the physiology and physiognomy of animals, which is what Charles Darwin was trying to do, because he didn't have genetics yet. Genetics helps you quite a lot. Then there is historical philology. That is the history of languages, how the languages evolved, and there is cosmology. Now, the easiest way to understand what I'm talking about visually is to ask, is this a science that models, that gives us models of trees? By trees, you look at the trees of languages, trees of species, trees of documents. These are all give you genealogies. If there is this genealogy, what the genealogy is about, what is common to all these genealogies is the transmission of information. It's where the information is coming from and how it is transmitted and how we're trying to take it back. If there are no trees or bushes, then it's not a historical science. It's not about the transmission of information. Now, for those of you who are intellectual historians, I think that some of you are intellectual historians, the interesting thing is to see that also it's the same people who developed all these sciences. It's not the modern distinction between, let's say, biology, geology, textual criticism. It did not exist originally. Originally, it were exactly the same people who applied exactly the same method. That is, if we need to put a date on it, then it will be sometime around 1750 when the first historical sciences emerged. And the first historical science was textual criticism. It was biblical criticism. Not the easiest subject matter, but it was just the subject matter that people were most interested in at the time. So the first insight was a very simple insight. It said, if we looked at texts in the Bible, and we assume that these are information signals, that's a language, of course, that I'm using, they didn't use it. They are information signals, but they move at different speeds. Some of them accumulate a lot of noise, others don't accumulate so much noise. Now, they looked at the book of Genesis, and they said, well, what is likely to be least changing, most reliable information signal? And they said, well, the name of God, because the name of God is holy. So people would be very reluctant to change the name of God. And then they counted 4 names of God in Genesis. And they said, well, if there are 4 names of God, those 4 names must originate in different sources. And some of them from the kingdom of Judah, some of them from the kingdom of Israel. And then they separated Genesis into these 4 sources, which is extremely easy to do. But just nobody was thinking about it in those terms. Once they had that methodology, and they used it on the scriptures, the New Testaments, the Old Testaments, it was very easy to move to the Greek sources. Because it's, again, texts, and again, you do the same division according to language. And from there, you use what they considered 200 years ago to be the master language, which was philology. And the question that they asked was which parts of language change more slowly than other parts of language, and then they are more reliable. We can construct the history of language from them. And the answer was the names of flowers, names of trees, names of places. I don't know about Brazil, but in the United States, names of places tend, many cases, to preserve the Indian names. And that's because that's part of language that changes very slowly. Now, words that have to do with politeness, with negotiation, with commerce, are the words that will change most quickly. Because you meet somebody else, you want to do business with them, you will learn a few, just like how I said obrigado right now. That's very useful for me. So, if I was living in Brazil, or if, there were 100 people like me, these were the words that we would assimilate first to our language. The words that are very useful for us when we deal with people who speak another language. So it will become our language. But These words, the words that refer to immediate body parts, fingers, hands, head, they also change very slowly. Immediate family members, mother, father, sister, brother. So these are, and if you want then to construct histories of languages, then what you want to look at is exactly this kind of vocabulary that changes most slowly. And then on the basis of that, you can construct the history of language. What was the origin of and how languages are connected. And from here, there's an interesting leap to evolutionary biology and to geology. Because if you look at species like languages, you can apply exactly the same method. And interestingly enough, Charles Darwin, when he tries to explain or convince people of his evolutionary theory, what he's doing is he's using metaphors from language. He says species as languages. And that's because people are already familiar with a hypothesis about the Indo-European languages and the common origins of languages. So when he wants to convince them about the history of species, he's saying, well, it's the same thing. And that's not just because he knows it, it's also because his cousin was writing etymologies for the English dictionary. And from there, it goes into geology, because sediments, you can look at sediments as, again, preserving information. So if you have a similar sediment, rock sediment in one location, and again, I think the examples are like Eastern Brazil and Western Africa, and you see that they fit, right? So what you discover is that they preserve information from the time that Africa and Brazil were the same continent. That's why it fits. In the same way that Sanskrit and ancient Greek fit. In the same way that if a historian goes to various archives and they discover, documents that fit each other, again, it preserves the same information signal. In the same way that if somebody wants next week to find out what I was speaking about today, and they speak to several people here in the audience, they will be able to see, well, it fits, as long as it fits. If there is conflicting evidence, then there's a problem. But if it fits, then you can construct all of that. And people like Ernst Haeckel in Germany, they were doing all of the above. They were doing philology, geology, evolutionary biology. So this was, in terms of intellectual history, it's not surprising at all that that's where it's coming from. One of the puzzles that sometimes historians talk about is about Ranke. The Leopold Ranke, the founder of modern history, and they say, well, he didn't study history in university. So how did he get it? Well, he studied philology. And his father was a Lutheran minister. So he had the biblical criticism and he had the philology. That's the methodology. It's not, that's where he got it. That's where you would get it. So Ranke was not an original methodologist. He just applied something that existed previously. Now, all the crowning achievement of all the historical sciences eventually is this tree. Now, I want to emphasize it's not so much the knowledge of the past as some kind of an empirical observation, which it is not, or the telling of the story. It's the inference of how the information that originated in the past got to the present, and what can we learn from that signal, how we can find information from the past in that signal. And eventually now, in the previous century, in the 20th century, the same kind of method was applied in physics to infer the existence of the Big Bang. Well, obviously nobody saw the Big Bang. What we have is the redshift, that we see that the further galaxies are speeding away from us. We have the background radiation, and all these phenomena preserve information about that original event that happened a very, very long time ago, and we will not see. Now, by contrast, the theoretical sciences are interested in types of events. and they're not interested in information. They're interested in events that can be repeated and can be observed. If you look at how they analyze data that they collect in laboratories, well, sometimes the experiments go wrong, and then you just ignore them. You do the experiment again, because you're not interested in a particular event that happened in the laboratory. That's not important at all. And a particular event that happened at a particular space at a particular time is insignificant. Because the theoretical scientist is not interested in this particular cell, or in this particular atom, or in this particular sound chamber. They're interested in atoms, in cells, that have no space and have no time. That's why you can ignore it if something goes wrong, because you're not interested in anything that is here. Unfortunately, historians cannot ignore elections that went horribly wrong. We cannot discard them, even though we would like to discard them very much. We have to try and understand them and the information that they transmit to us. This distinction between the historical and theoretical sciences runs through disciplines that I taught in university. So physiology is a theoretical science. Phylogeny is a historical science. Cosmology is a historical science. Theoretical physics is a theoretical science. Sociology is a theoretical science. Social history is a historical science. And again, just instinctively, if there's a tree of transmission of information, it's historical. No tree, no transmission of information. It's a theoretical science. Now, how do historical sciences then know about the past? And this kind of gets to my current work when I argue that the emphasis in philosophy of historiography on laws and causes and explanation is actually misguided, because historians do know about causes and they explain historical events, but these are all derived, they're secondary. The original quest is for origins. And let me give you just one illustrative example so you understand why I have this emphasis, and then I'll try to explain how historians infer origins. Suppose that you read a history of the First World War, and it says there at a certain point that there was a group of soldiers in the Maginot Line, and they came under heavy bombardment from the other side, and they retreated in fear, right? So if the emphasis that you put as a philosopher of historiography is on causes and explanations, you would say, well, the historian just made a causal assessment. They said that there was a heavy bombardment. The heavy bombardment caused fear. The fear caused the retreat. And it's also an explanation because the heavy bombardment explains why the soldiers retreated. Now, if you are a follower of, let's say, Hempel, then you will have to try and put it in some sort of covering law, something like whenever human beings are put in situation of extreme danger, they would retreat from the source of danger. You can also try and put it in probabilistic terms, saying they would tend to retreat rather than retreat. Now, the only problem with that is that human beings, when they are in danger, they have three possible reactions. Either they get angry and they attack back, or they freeze because they're so afraid and they don't move, or they retreat. And that's it. There are only three choices. And there are covering laws that would work with any one of them. You know, suppose that the soldiers attacked back, then they would say, okay, they got angry and they attacked back. Suppose they froze when they froze. And there's nothing in the initial conditions that would really lead to your conclusion. And what is more interesting is when the historian writes that the soldiers came under heavy bombardment and they became very afraid and they retreated, why does the historian do that? It's not arbitrary. It's not just a story. The historian has reason to say that. And the reason would be not psychology, because the historian usually doesn't know psychology. And it's not psychology also because even a very good psychologist would not be able to explain why people sometimes retreat in the face of danger, and other cases they attack back. The reason would be that the historian would look for evidence, and then he would find, let's say, a letter that some soldier wrote there to his girlfriend and said, we came under heavy bombardment, we got scared, and we ran away. And there would be another source, let's say the report of the commanding officer to his office, to his commander, and say, well, we came under heavy bombardment, we were forced to go away. That's what justifies it. It's not psychology, it's not a covering law. It's that there was an information signal, or information signals in plural, that were generated by the event, and they were preserved in the present. That's all you need. You don't need anything else. So the emphasis, so the historian did give a causal explanation, but this was derived from a very different sort of story, which is about the transmission of information. Because what the historian would really spend all his time on would be to find that letter that the soldier wrote to his girlfriend, and to authenticate that letter, that the letter is real and not a forgery, it's not mixed with noise, and that the letter is genuine in the sense that the soldier didn't have any reason to lie to his girlfriend. That's the sort of questions that the historian would be dealing with, about information, not about psychology. So I would put it in the following terms, because you always have to, you want to be a successful philosopher, you have to invent a terminology. So I call it origins. And it's derived from Darwin and the origin of species and so on. So I would say that the purpose of the historical sciences is to infer information about origins, not about events, not about causes, even though they tell you a lot about events, they tell you a lot about causes, and then they explain. But these are derived from their inferences of origins, from information preserving effects in the present, from receivers, from those receivers that receive the information from the past, right? So how do historians do that? Well, we start with information in the present. That's always, you have to start, something that is here that you can touch it. So there's information in the present, and the question that the historian asks is, where did this come from? If I'm holding this book, well, where did this come from? Well, it came from my suitcase, and eventually it came from the printer, and the printer got it from the university press, and the university press got it from me, and that's why I'm the author. And each stage has its own evidence. So if you really wanted to authenticate this, you wanted to be really clear that I was the author of this and nobody else, you would go to Cambridge University Press in England, to their archive, and you would ask to see the correspondence that I had with my editors about this book, and that would authenticate it. It would show that there were drafts, and there were referee reports, and then I revised it, and this is how we got there. And then you can write an intellectual history of this book. So when there is enough information, indeed you can reconstruct the whole process. So, if one of you was sufficiently deluded and really had nothing else to do in life, and they wanted to write an intellectual history of what I've been doing, there's really enough information there. You'd go to Cambridge University Press, and you will see the drafts that were submitted and how I revised it, and there will be a whole story there to write if you really have nothing else to do in life. But in other cases, in many other cases, there's just not enough information. And I argue that, in fact, there are three types of inferences. The most basic inference is that there was a common origin to information signals without really knowing anything about that common origin, just accepting that or how the signal was transmitted. That's why there's a distinction between information and causation. my favorite example of that is the Polynesian potato. Are you familiar with Polynesian potato? Okay. Well, in the islands of Polynesia, they ate potatoes before Europeans came. And to make it even more interesting, there is evidence, not conclusive evidence, but there is some evidence that they ate chicken in the 14th century in Latin America. Some places, there are burnt remains of chicken. Now, the interesting thing is that all the potatoes in the world come from the area of the Andes, and all the chicken originally are from Asia. If you look at this potato, not just as a potato, but as an information signal, what it tells us is that somehow the Polynesians made it to Latin America, which is kind of plausible, it's possible. But, and that's much more interesting, is that they found their way back to Polynesia without a compass, without map, without a written language. And somehow, quite possibly, they gave chicken in return. Now, how did they do that? Now, the only thing that we know for sure, we can know for sure, is that the origin of the Polynesian potato was in Latin America, because there's nowhere else it could get. Now, who are these people? How did, and the amazing thing is not that they got, you could get lost on a boat and, the currents would somehow carry you. If you survive long enough, you will end up in Latin America. But, or South America at that time, it wasn't Latin yet. But to get back. Now, a similar story is within the European languages. That is, the similarities between Sanskrit and ancient Greek are such that this is not a coincidence. There could not be, there's no reason for so many words to be similar, for the grammatical structure to be so similar without a common origin. But what that common origin was, who were the people who spoke that language, where did they live? Nobody knows. I mean, there are hypotheses about Anatolia in what is today's Turkey, and some people are trying to even reconstruct that language, but nobody even sure that there was such a language. Because another possibility is that you could have two people speaking an entirely different language, coming to live close to each other for a few thousand years, and then the languages merge, without actually the language ever existing, which you will find in all sorts of border areas, today. And if you go to Los Angeles, some parts, they already at a level of mixture of English and Spanish is such that you can talk about a new language emerging there. Hopefully it will continue. The only thing that you can prove is this is not a coincidence. Because there are no separate reasons. The probability of those information signals emerging independently of each other is close to nothing. I mean, what is the probability that somehow on a Polynesian island a potato would emerge independently, from some other plant, or that Sanskrit and ancient Greek would be so similar by coincidence? Very low probability. In other cases, and what is interesting here is that the more information rich is the signal, the less probable it is that the similarities are coincidental. The less information it carries, the more probable it is that it could emerge separately. So to take a couple of examples, in the history of life, wings were developed several times independently. Bats have wings, insects have wings, birds have wings, without a common ancestry, without a common ancestor of bats and birds that was a winged creature. If the police is collecting evidence about murder, right? So if several witnesses say, well, I saw it was, John Smith, who was wearing a white suit, and he used a certain type of revolver, and he was shouting something, it's an information-rich signal. If you have just everybody say, oh, it was John Smith who killed him, without saying anything else, it's information poor, and then it can have a very different reason. It could be that just several people have a reason to frame somebody because they don't like him for some reason. So they would all say, you know, the same thing about him. The first task of a historian is trying to distinguish this. Was there a good reason for the similarities that have nothing to do with preservation of information? The best example for that I know is about pyramids. You know, the Incas had pyramids, the Egyptians had pyramids, the Babylonians had pyramids. Now, the Babylonians probably knew about the Egyptian pyramids, so probably there was an influence there. But what about the Incas? So there was this weirdo, what was it, Erich von Dinken, who said it was all spaceships. Now, there's a very simple explanation of why there were pyramids. If you don't know about columns and arches, the only way to build a big building is to have a pyramid. Otherwise, it's going to fall. That's just the structure of the universe is such that you can try whatever you want. But if you don't know about arches, oops, and you don't know about columns, if it's not a pyramid, it is going to fall. So you don't need to have a common origin. It doesn't preserve any information about anything. It's just the structure of the universe. The same way that if you want to, if you don't have an animal that has jet engines, the only way that it can fly is to have wings. And it's very difficult to develop a jet engine, you know, by evolution. It's too big a leap, because hence, you know, and some plumage, it gradually can turn into wings. But there's really no part of the anatomy that is very conducive to become a jet engine. So that's the first thing that historians are doing. The second thing, if they can establish that there was a common information signal, probably, then, and that's usually the bigger task, is to construct the tree, the model of the transmission of information. Because in many cases, it will show us that the information that is being transmitted is not necessarily what we thought was transmitted, or the origin was different from the other origin. Again, to take the example of framing somebody for a crime that they didn't do, it can be very information-rich, but the origin does not have to be an event of a crime. The origin can be just a group of people sat together and decided to frame somebody. You know, like the plot of, let's say, the Comte de Monte Cristo, Victor Hugo. A group of people decide to frame somebody. Or if you look in Roman history, you'd be surprised how many Roman emperors are described to having married a prostitute and committed incest with their children. Now, that doesn't mean that they married a prostitute or had incest with their children. It's just that in Roman culture, if you wanted to offend a man, that's how you did it. That was the most offensive thing you can say about somebody. And that's why what the information that is being transmitted is that the author was a political enemy of this emperor. It doesn't tell you anything about their sexual habits. That's the art of the historian. And the historian, in that sense, I would consider them to be information scientists. Not experts about human nature, but experts about information and information transmission. And what historians really study, I would argue, the art of the historian, is about where to find information and what information is preserving. Sort of, what are the rules of preservation of information in certain archives? So to take a simple example of how historians corrected each other, historians of the United States asked themselves, to what extent during the American War of Independence against the British Empire, trade was bilateral between the mother country, England, and the colonies, and to what extent the colonists were trading with each other. And they looked in the archives of the port of Philadelphia, and they found that almost all the records were of trade of boats that were coming and going from England to Philadelphia. So one historian concluded, well, actually there wasn't a lot of trade between the colonies. It was all kind of monopolized by England. But then what another historian looked is what were the rules for recording boats in the port of Philadelphia. And then they discovered that in order for something to be recorded, the boat had to be big enough. Whereas the trade between the colonies usually was with smaller boats because it was smaller distance. And so actually the first study didn't teach us very much. Just told us indeed what was the volume of trade with Britain, but it didn't tell us anything about the volume of trade between the colonies themselves. So there was no basis for comparison. That's a rule about what information gets preserved and what information is not get preserved, and then what can you learn from what is being preserved. The same thing happened in biology. Before there was DNA and you could just compare genomes, which makes the whole work in certain respects much easier and more mathematical, they had to ask which part of the anatomy really preserve information. The general rule was the parts of the anatomy that are least functional. That is why that creatures have eyes and ears and limbs. Well, there's a very good reason for having that. If you don't have them, you're going to have a lot of problems surviving. But why should we have 5 fingers? Why not 4 or 6? Just as functional, right? Conclusion is, if you see creatures that have 5 digits, and if you see birds that have 5 digits in their wings, probably there's a common origin, because there's no reason for them to have it otherwise. There's no adaptational advantage of having 5 bones in the bat's wings rather than 4 or 6 or 7, right? This is all the art that is based on information preservation. Once you do that, once you have the tree right, you can learn quite a lot about the origins. And what you get in the last product of the historian, let's say, the narrative sometimes, is you base it on those inferences of origins. So what happens in historiography or in the historical sciences when we discuss knowledge of the past, it's like it's mostly hidden. Most of the research, it's like an iceberg. You know, it's 7/8 is under the surface, and that's the research the historians is doing about the transmission of information, where to look for the information, what's the information signal teaches us. Then in the end, it tells you what were the origins, and that's what we usually come to think is the history, the past. But that's really only in the end. And what I would argue is that what philosophers of history should do, what philosophers of historiography should do, is really study those hidden 7/8 of the iceberg, the research, the transmission of information. How is that done? And I didn't get into that here in this talk because it's kind of open to the public, is the probabilistic models that are involved and how you can model that using Bayesian probability. That's much of my work. And actually put numbers on it and make it look nice and precise and therefore prestigious. And not so much about the final product, the narrative, which really comes only at the end of that process. And I think it's good enough to open it for questions. Thank you.
Well, Professor Tuck, thank you very much. Let's start for questions.
If you think about, as an example, Newton, he has some works on physics. That's a science now that you know. But he has some works with not typical sciences like alchemy, astrology, alchemy. Yes, so how to deal with that, since one is preserved and the other one, the science try to put through the carpet?
I mean, the information signal from Newton are all preserved, and it's all. I think it's in the library of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem now, especially those non-scientific. But of course, what we're doing is we're using anachronistic terminology. Newton didn't make that distinction. For him, it was it was the same thing. Now, that we're using anachronistic concepts that he would not have recognized doesn't mean that we are wrong. Because, if a psychiatrist analyzes somebody who is delusional and that person does not see themselves as delusional, that doesn't mean that the psychiatrist is wrong and that person is not delusional. He can still be the president of the United States. The question is a question of evidence here. And does the evidence support the hypothesis that we are trying to draw? Is there a methodological distinction between what Newton was doing as a physicist, was we call today physicist, or he would be called a natural historian actually at his own time, or natural philosopher, sorry. He would be a natural philosopher, and the astrology and the alchemy and trying to compute when the end of the world will happen and so on. And I think you will find that there is a methodological distinction there, even if Isaac Newton did not recognize it. What's interesting for me is that he had no concept of history yet. He is not a historical scientist. He's a theoretical scientist, and then there's the other stuff. But he doesn't have a concept of the transmission of information in time and how it changes. That is something that only emerges in the middle of the 18th century publicly. I mean, by emerge, I mean in a social sense, because throughout history, people had insights into how information is transmitted. And sometimes it was associated with practical problems. So when the fathers of the church got together and had to decide which text to include and which text not to include, they used this kind of reasoning, this kind of historical reasoning that we use today. But then once there was the codex, that was the end of the story. Nobody kept it as a community. You would have individuals. But in the middle of the 18th century, for the first time, you have this idea that information is transmitted in time. And what I would argue, and didn't get very much into it, is the different probabilities that emerge when you have multiple independent sources. So just to give you a simple example, suppose that you want to, and it's very little into probability, but that's something that you can catch, anybody can understand intuitively without even knowing probability. Suppose that we know that there was a lottery yesterday, and each number had a chance of 1 in a million of winning. Now, you don't know, we bought a ticket, but we don't know who won, and we want to know who won. And suppose that we have one witness, and he happened to be schizophrenic. And we ask him, what's the number? Do you know which number won? And he says yes, and he gives us a number. Now, do we know which number won? I mean, the testimony is highly unreliable. You can't really base, I mean, if he tells you a number and that was the number that you have, you can't call your wife and say, you can't call your boss and resign. Let's put it this way. But, and here's the interesting stuff. Suppose there are two of them, and they don't know each other, and they don't communicate with each other. Two schizophrenics. 1 in a million number, they tell you the same number. You do know it. You can resign. You can call your wife, right? And interestingly enough, the first person to come with that mathematically is Laplace, around the turn of the 19th century. And that's something that you will not find, let's say, in the Greeks. That's not something that Herodotus or Thucydides would have. You have a principle in jurisprudence, both in Mosaic, in Jewish law, and in Greek law, that you need two witnesses. But there's no discussion of the mathematics of it, and when the historians are looking for evidence, they look for reliable evidence. They look for, a nobleman, somebody of honor. That they don't look for the two independent witnesses who may be, completely unreliable by themselves. And I use schizophrenic, I can use, toddlers, 3-year-olds, people that each one of them by themselves are utterly unreliable, but the probability, the joint probability of them coming up with the same information signal independently is so low that generates knowledge. That's something that people in Newton's time didn't know. They were still looking for that honorable witness. And the concept in Roman law was, what you wanted in Roman law was to have what they call a full proof. Full proof was that if I'm very honorable, I have half proof. You are very honorable, it's another half. So you have two of us, it's full proof. But if this gentleman is, half honorable, it's a quarter proof. I'm half honorable. It's another quarter proof. You are fully honorable. It's half a proof. So three of us together, again, gives us full proof. That was the concept. But what Laplace discovers, and that's something that then goes into anything from the Indo-European languages to the Polynesian potato, is even if it's extremely unreliable by itself, if it's independent and they preserve the same signal, you get the knowledge from that. That's the kind of mathematical quantum leap there.
Okay, Professor Sara.
Well, it was a pleasure listening to your lecture. It provoked many reflections. I would like to comment them all, but it's not the time or the place. But I selected one comment to start with, if you can say something on that. You are certainly familiar with the distinction between ideographic and nomothetical sciences, and it seemed to me that in the new distinction you propose, nomothetic sciences would be doing well, continuing being theoretical, but ideographic have gained a lot in your proposal of this signal reading way of probabilistic way of proceeding, because in the old naming, ideographic was a lot related to individual knowledge, things that are not repeated, and singular events, something you had to conform with to be a descriptive knowledge. And that would help narrativism today, would support them. But in your proposal, we escape from that. We go more scientific. I like that. I don't know if you agree or may add something.
Windelband's distinction between ideographic and nomothetic actually had an interesting afterlife, because people really don't study neo-Kantian philosophy today, at least not in the United States or places that I know. But it survived through Hempel. Hempel didn't give Windelband a footnote, but the idea of a covering law, well, what does it mean? It means covering law is nomothetic, and then the descriptions of the events are ideographic. That is, you describe them, and then you fit them into something, and then you get an explanation. And that's why I think it kind of caught in this kind of German environment, because everybody studied Windelband when they were students, and then they became logical positivists if they became logical positivists, so they kind of transformed the terminology. Now, my criticism is dual. First, the nomothetic is not really, I mean, the physics is not a nomothetic science, because it deals with theories, and the theories are about symmetries, usually. There are very few actual laws. There was a period, it's really, the concept of science as a law is so connected to Newton that it's really not very easily extrapolated beyond Newton. Now, the main problem with the ideographic is that you're supposed to describe something. Now, what are you describing exactly? As I said, I never met Napoleon, and I never will. So I can't describe Napoleon. It's not, when I write about Napoleon, you know, when I say that he was short, I think, and he liked to put his hand here and so on. What I do is, it's not the kind of description that I would write, you know, if my wife asked me, who was your host in Sao Paulo, and I will say, well, there was this professor and that professor, and I would describe from my memory what I saw. What I do as a historian when I want to describe Napoleon is I go to the archives and I collect evidence about how Napoleon looked like and how he behaved, and I compare them and I try to find out which one of them preserved a signal from the real Napoleon authentically, and even if the sources are not very reliable, as long as they agree and they're independent, then there's this mathematical quantum leap. What I don't want is, of course, to base my description of Napoleon on sources that were hostile to him and wanted to present him as, as ugly and despicable and stinking and so on. The idea of an ideographic science is an impossible ideal because there's nothing to describe. All that we do is we try to extract information that exists in the presence. And then we are totally beholden to that information. Because, there are a lot of things that we would like to know about the past that just there's no information present and there's no way of, and some things probably we will never know. We will never know what was the religion that people had 10,000 years ago. They left these figurines that you find all over Europe. But who were these people? There's just not information, no information was preserved, and we will never know. There's nothing to describe. But the only thing that we can do is try and extract information from the evidence in the presence. So in that respect, this distinction doesn't hold. What the distinction that I suggest is between sciences that are basically information sciences. What they're trying to do is infer information about origins of information signals that had a specific space and a specific time. And other sciences that are not interested in anything that happened in a particular space in a particular time. And those sciences, the theoretical sciences, they can have laws, sure, but they don't have to. They can just be about types of symmetries, which is, in quantum physics, you don't really have laws. What you have is symmetries. You show symmetries, or about theories. And theories are very complex structures. They can include laws. They can include also probabilities. They can include a lot of things. They can include universal constants, the Avogadro number. That's not a law, but if you try and measure the Avogadro number in a laboratory, and the number that comes wrong, then it just comes wrong, and you'll count it again because probably there was something wrong with your setting or something wrong with the instrument that measured it, right? But it's not the time to dump the theory or to dump the law. Because the object, what you try to study, is really not what is there in the laboratory. What you're trying to study is what a theory about a type of thing that corresponds with something that can happen in the laboratory. By contrast, historical sciences, they are interested in things that happen in a particular place in a particular time, not in timeless objects, in my opinion.
Let me try, and he'll correct me. He said you made clear that this, for a history, this methodology of looking for origins in the ways you proposed will be helpful for a historiography that's worried about establishing facts, for example. Right? But if you think of historiography that's worried with values or how a society changes its way of regarding the past or the future, then it would be harder to use this kind of signal reading procedures. He's doing a good job, doesn't need a translation.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I mean, obviously this theory is not going to, historical sciences have nothing to say about the future. I wish they did, but they can't. There's no methodology for that. What questions of, it's not just, first the distinction between fact and other things, I don't think holds very much, because if you remember the example I brought of the soldiers retreating, an explanation course, that's all in information, it's all in the information signal. And if you want to study values of the past, then it's the same thing. You know, if you take, for example, if you study a little bit of Roman history, history of the Roman Empire, and you read a little bit of Roman literature, Roman plays, right? You would encounter this weird phenomenon that after a while, you would notice that the place of people with physical deformities in that literature is very different from your own. That is, if you are a Jew or a Christian, you have compassion towards people who have physical deformity, and you empathize with them, and you certainly don't laugh at them. That is, if you ever did that when you were a child, your parents, you know, or your priest or somebody stopped you, and you know not to do that. You would see that in Roman comedy, when somebody comes on stage and doesn't have a leg, that's the time to laugh. That was their system of values. Very different from our own. And I'm bringing this example because, for me, this is the ultimate example of lack of empathy. There's no Verstehen there. I don't understand what it's like to laugh from somebody who has physical deformity. I don't think it's funny at all. I can't even imagine how it could be funny. But I have this external understanding from reading those texts that for the Romans, that was funny because of the structure of the literature. So I can tell you, as you know, if I'm a Roman historian, that in the Roman system of values, there was no compassion for people who had physical deformities. They laughed at them because they were weaker than them, because they were not perfect, they didn't have a perfect body, and they found it funny. That was their system of values, which is not my own. But certainly I can recover this information signal that the ancient Romans transmitted to me. And the same thing is if you talk about social evolution. Well, if there are elections, and elections have a certain unexpected results, what historical scientists would do is they would go and look at the information that is preserved, like regional differences, if there are polling differences between ages and social groups, and try and make an inference about the hidden element there. What was really going on in those elections? How society evolved. And that's all, it's the same. It doesn't matter if it's about an event or a process or an evolution or values. It's exactly the same thing. What it is not is about society, you know, as all human society. It's not about language, and it's certainly not about the future.
Okay, let me make my question now. Okay, you start your talk, and for me, you talked about the scientific methodology of historians, most of your talk. And we started talking about Newton and let's say this positivism vision of knowledge. And then you talk about the probabilities. That's something that science and physical science learned to like in the 20th century, like the physicists with quantum mechanics, like probabilities. And I like your perspective of studying events in science with probabilities. The question is that from the physical perspective, low probabilities is very easy to choose. Like say for a few percent that this is true, it's okay. It's 90% true, it's also okay. The problem is between that, how you put a number. So, and even more when you have events that some events are positive correlation. So if this is likely, something else is also likely. Or negative correlation, if this is likely, something should be unlikely. So, and then I put my question to you. If we could, let's say, put a probability number with certain precision, it doesn't matter exactly how. If we could put a probability that could run from 0 to 100% to a certain set of facts, could we think about historians, like theoretical historians, like building a framework of a society, making like a, let's say, a computer simulation of a certain society in time and space based on this set of probability of events?
Right. You said several different things. So first, the problem of quantification. So, because obviously historians, even though I claim they are doing a lot of work that involves probability, they're not telling you, Napoleon was the emperor of France and the probability of that is 0.999. So they don't give you that number. Well, I think they don't have to, because usually what they work with is just sufficiently big gaps that you say this is entirely improbable unless something was the case. So if you think, for example, about the lottery ticket example, how probable it is that those two children or two schizophrenics would come exactly with the same number if this is not true, and they are and you know that they are independent of each other. It's sufficiently unlikely, and I can put a number on it, because I gave you an example with 1 million, and then all I need to do is just give a reliability to the witness. If I can give it, let's say 0.1, and I'll give you a number. But it doesn't matter, because the number, the probability that this is a coincidence is so low that you can just discard it. And you can see it intuitively. You don't even need to know the numbers. What historians do, they do use correlations to infer information that is hidden in signals. A very good example of that would be the political implications of writing. That is, writing in all the civilizations that archaeologists worked on was always developed first to record taxes. That is, people invented writing so they know which family gave how much tax to the king, to keep the record of that. Therefore, if you find a civilization that you know nothing about and you see that they had writing, the conclusion is that they must have had a centralized government that was taxing the population. And that's one thing because of this strong correlation. Now, my argument would be, you can look at it as social. It's a sociological correlation, which is true. I look at it as a correlation between two pieces of information. The obvious information signal that is preserved here, here I see a piece of pottery with writings on it in a language that nobody knows yet, right? Okay, it's writing. This is not art. This is writing, because there are characters and it's repeated and so on. I have this information. But the other piece of information that is preserved here is that there was a centralized government. And that's inferred from that probabilistic correlation. And that's a very extremely strong probabilistic correlation, because there's really no civilization that had writing that didn't have, initially at least. Of course, the centralized government can disappear and the writing will be preserved. But initially, the invention of writing, the acceptance of writing in all the civilization that we know of was always associated with taxation. Now, whether you can have some kind of sociological generalization that do not involve this kind of reasoning that is based on preservation of information, or whether you can use historical knowledge to make sociological generalization. Yeah, sure, you can do that, but then you're not a historian, then you do something else. It's in the same way that you can infer a lot of things about the history of language, and then you can try and do this kind of Chomskyan analysis of the universal properties of language, and then you can try and test, does it fit all the languages that we know? And I think the main challenge to that came from this country, right? That there was this tribe that supposedly doesn't.
Very convincing, but yes.
Yeah, that it's not my field, but I'm just giving you an example.
Mine neither, but it seems Chomsky himself is not.
Yeah, he's MIT. What do you expect? The preservation of information here is useful for trying to test theoretical generalizations. And the theoretical generalizations then are not about history. They're about objects that don't have a particular space and time. Because what Chomsky argues is that any language, you don't have to look at, where is it from, or who spoke it, when spoke it. That's what language is. And sociologists can say, all human societies have certain general properties and so on.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. So I read a few questions that I make. You said that what makes a good history is the evidence. So I was thinking, how does the style influences a good historical writing? And is there a properly historical style of writing? Is the main question. And the other one is in your opinion, what's the main difference between the methodology of history and the philosophy of history?
Right. Then I would argue that in order for us to identify something as a piece of evidence, we need to start with information theory. That is, that's what we start up with. Or as Arthur Danto was a philosopher of historiography, he said once, nobody walks naked into the archive. You always wear a theoretical suit that tells you what to look for and what is more reliable and what is less reliable. You use this information theory to tell you what evidence is useful. Then the result, a successful result, is that you find out something that is highly probable about the past. And obviously, if you want to be successful as a historian, it should be new. It shouldn't be something that people already know. It should be that's what makes you a successful historian's historian, right? By that I mean the kind of historian that other historians say, oh, that's a great historian. Not necessarily the public, right? For the public to say that somebody is a great historian, it has to be good literature, you know. So, for example, if I want to advise somebody about a good book about the Roman Empire, I'm not going to advise them to read Gibbon. It's so outdated, you know, it's 18th century, we know so much more today and so on. If you want to read a good book about the Roman Empire, Gibbon is a very good book. It's going to be a lot of fun reading. He was a great writer. That's the kind of distinction that I'm drawing. And since my criteria is epistemic, you know, it's about knowledge, then what's more important for me is to get the highly probable knowledge of the past rather than to convey it in a nice, you know, literary way. The distinction between historiography and the philosophy of history, or the philosophy of historiography, well, I see that as a continuity. My model is very much like in the history and philosophy of science, that the philosophy of science is really continuous with science proper. It's on a meta level, like you observe it, but you're not outside of history. There is no outside of history. You are in history. You're looking at history from within history, which makes me sound like German already, or French. And you are trying to come up with the best explanation of what historians are doing. That is, if you want to do philosophy of science and you ask, you know, what is science? What's a good way of starting? Well, you say, can we agree on what is great science? And people would say, Newton, Darwin, Einstein. Okay, we can all agree that they were great scientists. They did great work. So what is common to all of what they did? You know, obviously they worked on different fields. Darwin worked on species. Einstein worked on light. Different subject matters. But they used certain common methodologies. So if only Einstein used it, it may be great, but it's not like science, right? And I would argue that what philosophers of historiography should do is pretty much the same thing. Let's ask, who are the great historians? You know, Brodel, Marc Bloch, Leopold Ranke, right? So what is common to all of what they did? And try and come out with the best explanation that would fit everything that they did. And look at what they did, not look at what they said that they did. Because what people say that they do is usually very unreliable. Because when you present yourself, you know, in terms that justify yourself, you apologize for yourself. But, you know, the old New York joke about the two psychiatrists who meet each other and they immediately say, you are fine, how am I? I think it's very true, because, you know, you understand the other guy, you don't understand yourself. And historians, I don't have too much respect for this theoretical history literature, because that's historians sort of trying to explain themselves. Sometimes they don't always have the sufficient abstract language to even, you know, look at themselves from without. That's something that I think philosophers can do very well. Now, it still continues because when I do philosophy of historiography and I look at the history of historiography, you know, I read Ranke and Brodel and what have you, I'm doing history of history writing. I am also a historian, not just a philosopher. I just use abstract terminology and abstract framework that I get from philosophy to do that. But I'm also a historian. It's not that there is this kind of borderline, you know, that I would be against erecting any kind of wall between anything, including history and philosophy.
Good morning. Speaking about evidence, I remember I think that is not present in Brazil, but in countries like USA, England, there is the debate between creationism and evolutionism, and there is I think especially in USA there is more common. And the two sides of the debate, they use the evidence, but I think it's like different concepts of evidence they use. How the historians see that, how the evolutionists use the evidence, and how the creationists use the evidence to affirm their ideas.
Well, as you know, the United States is far from being a united country, and there's not much debate between evolutionists and creationists. There's just different groups of people. I don't know any creationist. The use of evidence, well, obviously historians, natural historians, are using certain information transmission theories that creationists don't recognize. So a creationist and an evolutionary scientist can look at the same fossil and they can agree that there's a piece of rock here with certain patterns. They would just interpret it as two different things, because the evolutionary biologists will see it as preserving information about things that happened a million years ago. And the creationist would not work with the same information transmission theories. And the same thing you can look about the interpretation of the Bible. That is, a creationist and evolutionary biologist can agree, okay, here's the text of the Bible, and it came from the printer. And the printer took it from a certain translator, and the translator got... So you would get, eventually, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th century, that everybody could agree about all the tree that led from the 3rd or 4th century to the texts that we have today. That's okay. What they would disagree about is what happened before, because what the scientist would do is he would take the text and make linguistic distinctions and would compare what are the similarities and the differences between the texts. And then the going, hypothesis is that there were two texts. One was a text about the life of Jesus, and the other text was about the things that Jesus said. Presumably, they must have been written in Aramaic. Texts that we have today were in Greek. And then they were translated and put together and so on and so forth. And there is this gap of about 50 years between the time that Jesus may have lived and the text that we have today. And what happened during that time, of course, is anybody's guess. And there's no evidence about what happened during those 50 or so years before you get the first texts. The first reliable texts are the epistles of St. Paul, which are, authentic to that time. But then there's very little about Jesus there, and the gap between the time is not enough to authenticate. You don't have any contemporary sources about Jesus. It would have been nice to get the diary of Pontius Pilate. It would have resolved an issue or two, but we don't have that. So the question is, how reliable are the texts that we have today? And that would depend on, again, on information transmission theories, because some people would say, well, it's not terribly reliable. The sources are distant in time. They're not objective. They had political, religious, agenda to push, and you can show what were those different agendas. Other people would say, well, they are reliable.
One is, would you agree that information transmission theory is an outcome of philology, successful, and so you are one of the, you are responsible with your theory to bringing an updating to this very successful historical tradition of philology? And the second one is just a clever remark. Would you say that Hegel had to die to give room to historical knowledge based in evidence? You said that Hegel had to die. So would you agree that he had to die too to give room to Ranke and historical knowledge based on evidence?
No, I mean, they were contemporaries at the University of Berlin. Ranke got his job when Hegel was still there. Hegel didn't have a problem with Ranke. I totally agree that philology was the air science. That's where it all started, and that's something that over the centuries got kind of, at least in popular culture, got forgotten. When I was a student, if you wanted to study philology, people said, "Oh, yeah, must be pedantic, boring." Well, it undermined the whole foundation of religion and culture and everything. I mean, it was the ultimate revolutionary science at its time. And then if you apply the same methods to biology and so on, and geology, which people did, it's also a revolutionary science. So you can definitely argue that I'm doing philosophy of philology, and I try to understand, indeed, what was so great about philology, why it was so important 200 years ago. And it revolutionized. Now, with Bayes, actually, Bayes is not Bayes. Bayes is Laplace, because Bayes wanted, I mean, his project was to prove the existence of God. That was his project. He wanted to project back from the evidence to get a probability that God exists, because he was a priest. And when he failed in that, he discovered, it's a wonderful thing, he went on basically an impossible project to give a probability to the existence of God. He discovered wonderful things, but he didn't solve his impossible problem. And then years later, Laplace, who was working with probability and was not concerned with the problem of the existence of God, rediscovered the same things without knowing about Bayes. But since Bayes was first, then people say, Bayesian logic, because he was the first, so he should get the right. The problem with that is not, problem is that Bayesian logic or Bayesian probability is used in just about anything in the sciences, from energy, from the probability of drilling for oil in a certain place, to inferring phylogenies, and that's explicit. Now, historians don't know that. It's like speaking prose. You either speak in poetry or you speak in prose, but you don't necessarily know that. Or you use certain types of logical arguments without knowing these are modus ponens or modus tollens, and so on. Now, I would argue that historians are basically Bayesian. They're using Bayesian models, and they're doing probability about information, even though they have no idea what I'm talking about. They never heard about Bayesian probability. They don't know about probability. They don't think about themselves as information scientists. They think about themselves as, medieval French historians. Not, and then it's a problem of trying to convince people of that, because also then, if I'm right, then maybe they should study a bit of probability, and who likes to do that, and philology. These are not popular subjects. But I believe that they are important subjects, and they give us a fruitful approach to understanding the problem of historical knowledge. It gives us insights that are otherwise unavailable if you don't use these kinds of conceptual tools.
Okay, let's finish it here. Let's thank again Professor Tucker. Thank you, Professor.